All right, good morning, everyone. Hopefully everyone can now hear that we've started the webinar. Sorry for the couple of moments there, trying to make sure that everyone who we knew was joining us had gotten started. So welcome. This is a webinar here today about career centers in the MENA region. And a couple of things to begin with. Holistically, we're going into this webinar with the idea that career centers are a very important resource for youth who are completing secondary, TVET, and university studies to gain skills, awareness, exposure, and experience with the realities of work and to better understand their job prospects. Before I go on, I just want to make sure that everyone is able to hear this. I see some people typing. Okay, great. I will continue. Thank you for confirming that. So career centers can and should look different based on who they are intended to support, the context in which they will be established, and the available resources. This webinar is not an evaluation of a few specific career centers, but rather a regional overview of what we learned in reviewing published materials about career centers with an established presence in the specific educational institutions, as well as literature on best practices in career centers in the region and globally. Before addressing the question of whether career centers are effective uses of U.S. government, university, host government, international donor, or other funds, it's important to understand the key lessons learned and key approaches at work in existing career centers, as these realities give the scope and scale of initial investments and ongoing resources needed across a range of career centers. With these points in mind, this webinar is intended as a framework of key considerations that should guide strategic planning before making an initial investment in career centers or when considering the ongoing resources required to sustainably operate career centers. So welcome, and we're excited to share this information with you. Just to present a little bit about myself, I'm Dr. Amy Porter, and I focus my research on school-to-work transitions, looking at entrepreneurship education and gender, and a lot of my research has focused on West Africa and looking specifically in urban contexts. In a lot of the research I've done in West Africa, I've seen that youth really do not have great access to resources like career centers, so I'm excited to have had this opportunity to look through literature on career centers across the MENA region and to really elaborate and have a discussion here and begin a discussion about the role that career centers can play in specifically helping students to find their place in the working world. I'll be presenting the webinar today, but I'm also here, and this presentation has been supported by Khadija, who's joining us from Morocco, who will be participating in the Q&A session at the end of the webinar, as well as my colleagues Meredith and Natalie. In terms of formatting for the webinar, if you have any questions at any time throughout the webinar, please feel free to type those up into the chat box. My colleagues will be curating these, and we'll be addressing them during the Q&A session at the end. Additionally, if you encounter any technical difficulties, please let us know again through the chat box, and my colleague will address those in real time. So thank you, and once again, we're really excited to have you with us here today. In terms of agenda, we'll begin by looking at the research questions that guided this study, the design and methods, determining where and how to invest in career centers, specifically looking at initial investments and ongoing resources. Moving on to career center approaches that are being used to bridge from school to work, comparing career center approaches within TVET and universities, and finally moving on to the Q&A discussion. First, in terms of research questions, we had three main research questions that are guiding this study. The first, what are the key lessons learned, strategies, and results from career center programs? The second, what approaches are educational institutions taking to promote career development and workforce skills? And the third, have career centers given youth opportunities to design, plan, and lead? In order to answer these questions, we conducted a desk review, and we looked at 6 categories of literature. These were donor project reports, ministry and government reports, local NGO studies, international organizations reports, and academic literature. In terms of framing, we focused on materials published from 2010 into the present. And the reason behind that was that these were both post the Great Recession as well as post the Arab Spring, which each of these had a big impact on youth unemployment and its focus in literature and policy. The research design, this is a primary research-informed desk review. This webinar is part of the research process, and today we're presenting from literature on the topic of career centers globally in some cases, but primarily focused on the MENA region. Over the next few weeks, the research team will be conducting additional primary research to fill gaps that emerge from this desk review. And this will include 2 pieces. One is an online survey for all webinar participants, and the second is a remote key informant interviews with a sample of webinar participants and other experts. A copy of this webinar, recorded in English and in Arabic, will accompany the survey, the electronic survey invitation. And the full report will be publicly available in early 2019. Okay, sorry, we have a quick question on, we just want to make sure that the slides are following accurately. So Danielle's comment is probably helpful. Apologies for that. I'm clicking through the slides, but apparently we need people to click manually. Is that, or if I click on that, do I need to advance it then? Okay, I will make sure that I read off what slide number. We did number these slides, so we're currently on slide number 5. So it should say supply and demand. Apologies, that seems to be not moving along with what I'm seeing on my screen. So slide number 5, the title supply and demand is, sorry, where we're at here. I will make sure I identify what slide we're on going forward. So here, the question is, how do career centers support matching youth to employment opportunities? And this is a key question in discussing youth unemployment globally. In the report, we'll take a bit more time to elaborate the key demographics of youth unemployment in the MENA region and the contextual factors that must be considered in designing and implementing career centers in the region. But at this time, we're going to jump right into this question of the balance between investing additional resources into skills and training for career services and career services for youth. So really the goal on this side of the equation on the left is increasing the supply of well-trained potential workers. And on the other side of this, looking at the economic interventions and investing in interventions that support businesses' growth and the ability to hire new workers, especially for jobs that are well-paid, stable, physically and mentally safe. So increasing the supply of desirable jobs. What we see here is that in terms of supply, students need to learn soft skills and life skills, including how to be entrepreneurial about their careers or to become entrepreneurs as well. And students need more complete and accurate information about labor markets and career options. On the other side, increasing the supply of jobs, while small and medium businesses or employers often have open positions, these are not always desirable jobs for those that have completed higher levels of education, and they may feature inadequate employment conditions, informality, underemployment, vulnerable employment, or low-paid jobs. Or they may be in open positions that require highly specialized skill sets, so they're not entry-level and cannot easily absorb school-educated but unemployed youth. So between these two investment options is a mismatch between education of youth and labor market needs. So we have school credentialed youth that are disillusioned by entry-level jobs and employers that are seeking well-trained and experienced employees. This is really the crux of the issue in which career centers can intervene. On slide 6 now, titled Global Example of Sequencing Career Guidance, Bridging School to Work. Before diving into the MENA-specific literature, I wanted to highlight from the OECD, they have published many notable global studies on career centers and career guidance. So looking along the column to the left, the OECD connected categories of career guidance. They divide career guidance into 4 categories. The first, career education, where students are learning about the world of work, developing career management skills through classroom teaching or other activities. There's career information on courses and occupations, learning and career opportunities, progression, routes and choices, as well as information on where to find help and advice and how to access it. Individual career counseling on a one-on-one basis, providing specific career advice and decisions, either proactively, meaning mandatory interviews for all, or reactively, on demand. And finally, the direct contact with the world of work. And this is opportunities to gain firsthand insights into and experiences of the labor market in order to raise, broaden, or inform career aspirations. We also see that the report, this 2018 version of the OECD report, maps career guidance tools that could be used during different stages of a student's life. So they're actually starting, there's ages across the top there, as young as 3, looking all the way out to the age of 29. And I think what's important to see in what they've pulled together here is that various approaches are linked to hopeful results, especially for marginalized youth or youth that are experiencing challenging situations. So some of the things that career guidance and career centers can do, looking at tackling stereotypes and widening horizons, decreasing negative effects of socioeconomic background, assisting disadvantaged youth, increasing self-esteem and motivation, providing quality information about occupations, raising awareness of and learning about employment opportunities, and really generally facilitating the school to work transition. So there's a lot of optimism about what can be done through sound career guidance across different ages. And so in the table, there's some examples at different ages, what they're recommending. And again, this is a global report. Moving to slide number 7. The cost effectiveness of career approaches. This is really a framework of kind of key considerations in initial investments and ongoing investments in career centers. In terms of initial investments, 2 main things, and we'll go into a lot of detail throughout the presentation about these particular points. First, in terms of planning and establishing a career center strategy, and second, developing key relationships. So these are really 2 things. They're both financial as well as human resource intensive in terms of initial investments in career centers. And what is often overlooked is what we've seen in the literature or given less attention is the need for strong ongoing investments and a sound strategy for what that will look like. There's fairly limited evidence on the ongoing operational costs of career center approaches. Cost benefit analyses are quite rare. What we've seen is for 30 out of 84 interventions that were all reviewed in one study, total program costs and budgets range somewhere between $70,000 on a very low end and $33 million on a very high end. So really what these look like, there's a lot of flexibility, but the specific analyses of approaches are still a bit rare, and we'll talk a little bit about how that could be improved here as well. And finally, the institutional and financial stability of planning is key, but that lacks in a lot of career centers. So this hopefully is intended to be helpful information, both if there's a career center that is already in operation or initially planning. This could be part of a re-strategization of career center options. So we're on slide number 8 now, strategic planning considerations. So in more detail, we have bucketed these into sort of 4 categories here of strategic planning consideration. The first is approaches. And here it's really that it's important to assess what already exists when designing career center approaches for any specific intervention. First, looking at within the institution, what other career center aligned services are being provided, as well as looking at through the government, through employment programs, through civil society, for example, perhaps entrepreneurship training programs, or through the private sector, things like perhaps resume reviews or assistance, mock interviews, things like that. Even though all of these services may not be available to all students at educational institutions, it is important to know what the range of services that exist in a context are and be able to understand which ones make sense to fit into the planned career center. Also, it's important to understand the shifting labor market needs. Innovation in a variety of terms of topics, activities, trainings to be delivered by career centers really need to match shifting labor market needs. In terms of key partnerships, and we'll go into more detail about this as well, definitely with government ministries, making sure that those partnerships are solid and that there's buy-in from the government is hugely important here. Educational institutions administration, as well as their faculty, and developing those partnerships, as well as with the private sector with large companies and small and medium enterprises. For targeted outcomes, what we're meaning here in terms of strategic planning considerations is thinking through whether the Career Center is intended to be an employment program where it's focused on students' job placement outcomes, or an employability program, so focused on preparing university and TVET students to become successful in the job market. So there's a slightly nuanced difference between how those would be approached, and planning for inclusive service provision. So making sure that all categories of young people are being considered and planned for within the Career Center. And finally, in terms of infrastructure, 3 categories to kind of bring up here. One is the physical space. This is something where often the educational institution can show their support by providing some sort of space for the Career Center to be located. Technological infrastructure, understanding what is and isn't possible based on what infrastructure exists or what could be developed. And then in terms of personnel, so who is staffed at the Career Center, what are their roles, what training they receive, and this is where we'll start in a bit more detail here. So in terms of, on slide 9, personnel considerations, in all fields, it's obviously important to employ high caliber staff, career counselors and staff. Personnel is a significant ongoing expense, so hiring well is very important. But even hiring good personnel, there's often an additional need for training and support. Some ideas in the literature that seemed to work well at career centers was considering bringing training capabilities in-house, as this reduces costs and allows for better quality monitoring. And by this, I was referring to training of trainer systems, in essence utilizing master trainers to train new staff. Another strategy, internally standardizing and codifying training, operations, and reporting, which supports institutional knowledge management, making sure that everyone is on the same page about standard setting and what should be known and how services should be provided. Providing professional development opportunities for Career Center staff, things like study tours, which would mean visiting other career centers, or either remotely or physically visiting other career centers. Having these professional development opportunities can increase effectiveness of staff, can counter attrition that has been experienced, and we've seen in a lot of career centers in this region, and can spread best practices. Externally, external to individual career centers, the industry of career guidance is also undergoing a professionalization in the MENA region. Career center personnel certification programs is something that is starting up but needs to be more fully addressed across the MENA region. As well, thinking externally, collaborating with career centers globally can really support nascent programs to overcome challenges and maximize impact. And finally, in terms of personnel, whether this is the director or another staff person, it is important to identify at least one person that is considered a business development lead. So as we turn our attention to partnerships shortly, it is very important that there is staff that are able to manage the multiple relationships required at career centers between private sector, governments, and across the institutions. Also important in thinking about training and hiring staff, as well as broadly planning for a career center, is thinking about fostering an inclusive environment. Career centers should plan to incorporate marginal populations in their strategy and design, so including low economic status students, working students, those from rural areas, youth with disabilities, whether that's visual, hearing, physical, women, ethnic minorities, etc. And within literature, we see that career centers can be a space to lead the integration of people with disabilities and vulnerable populations within educational institutions. Integrating these needs in the design phase is really the most assured way to know that they will actually be carried through as the career center is planned and operated. Also important to build faculty and staff capacity to integrate and work with students with disabilities. That's often something that's lacking more broadly in educational institutions and faculty. That's also, if possible, offering scholarships and financial assistance to those that have more difficulty accessing these services in general. And one way to ensure that the career center planning is really fitting with and fostering an inclusive environment is collaborating with civil society organizations that work with people with disabilities as well as those that are focused on women's rights, and getting their perspective on whether what you're planning is actually inclusive. Specifically, to encourage and ensure women's participation and that they're benefiting from career centers, considering common barriers to women's participation is important. Things like thinking about their security, travel, timing of activities, and the fact that there are often competing household and caregiving responsibilities. It's important that women representatives from across industries are included in activities and approaches. For example, organizing gender-oriented activities. We saw career centers that invited women entrepreneurs, for example, as guest speakers. And finally, particularly for women, we think it's very important to reinforce that it's not only that women are using career center services, but also thinking through women that are actually gaining employment. We know that there's been dubbed a MENA paradox, where women are receiving in greater numbers higher education degrees, but continue to have low employment rates. On slide 11, in terms of planning out a career center, it's also very important to think about monitoring and evaluation from the career center's inception. If it doesn't already exist, it can also be added. But this is something where we see there's not a lot of specific firm numbers on what's actually happening in many career centers. And that's something that really should be there from the beginning to know if a career center is meeting its objectives and be able to measure and track this. As well as this is a MENA-wide webinar that we're giving today, I wanted to take a moment to highlight as well that it would be very exciting to have potential regional alignment on what sort of metrics make sense to track, and thinking about building a database or a way of sharing information that is consistent and could be really measured across different institutions within countries and across the region. In general, there's a cyclical process of M&E that should be undertaken. And separately, but to ensure program sustainability, it's also important to measure and track costs. So financial budgeting, forecasting, actualizing, all of that is made much more possible when you're tracking and monitoring what's happening within the career center. In terms of the sort of cyclical process, starting with building capacity in the career center staff, oftentimes this is a skill that needs to be taught. So providing room and space to ensure that staff understand why this is important and how to do it. In terms of surveying, moving clockwise around the page here, determining what goals, what's important to measure and how to measure for your specific career center or for a broader range of career centers, and then systematically conducting M&E to ensure that you have those data points. Tracking, that's looking at program outcomes over the long term. One way to do this is to start a database of youth beneficiaries to be able to track and follow what is happening to young people that have received career center services. In terms of develop, This is building comprehensive data sets, linking the programs across institutions. This is where kind of sharing of information can happen. And as well, there's linking to labor market studies and secondary data. So making sure you are on track and understanding the labor market as it shifts, and that the services you're providing remain relevant to what's most needed in the labor market. Shifting to slide 12, our first research question here. So it's addressing key challenges. And where we really focused on this sort of key challenges is initiating career centers requires cultivating sustainable partnerships among educational institutions, government, and private sector industries. So these are this develop the relationships piece of initial investments. On slide 13, so we first look at collaboration between career centers and the government. So in this arena, youth employment really cuts across ministerial mandates and involves many public organizations. So it's important to think about the full range of government contexts that would make sense to fit within a career center. The satisfaction of government ministries largely depends on their level of implication in the project. So we saw in the literature things that policies and programs must seek complementarities across actors and interventions. For example, reaching a student population with career center services may reduce the government need to work with these youth at unemployment offices upon graduation. So thinking of where a career center is reinforcing some of the work government is already doing, but specifically for the student population. So, being able to eliminate the problem of youth unemployment by reaching youth and helping to bridge their transition from school to work. Another example of this is looking at cooperation between TVET training centers, career centers, and unemployment offices. So thinking about these sort of synergies and understanding what the government is already doing and how to link those up to what the career center wants to do. Effective ways, strategies for ministerial engagement. They include frequent communication, early engagement, demonstrating an understanding of global career center best practices. We see some other effective ways, forming a national steering committee and inviting government stakeholders to career center organized outreach events. When government collaboration goes well, we see a lot of positive things. We had some statements from different career center evaluations that looked at comments like the USAID Career Center has become even more than what we expected. It's become an interface between training centers and employers. And another Minister of Higher Education saying that they'd consider this sort of model, but we're a little unsure about how to actually execute. And so they had received technical and financial support, and that this really made the program come to life in a way that they felt like they were unable to do before. So the government can be very excited about these sorts of programs when they work well. On slide 14, it's important to also consider when collaborating with the government the existing forms of workforce development support for unemployed youth. So before kind of presenting a collaboration strategy, understanding what already exists. So we know that there are labor offices, public employment services, active labor market programs, and one-stop shops. These are all different strategies that the government already is using. They're not tailored to students so much, so that is where career centers are somewhat unique in that way, but they are all looking at unemployment broadly and youth unemployment within that. Most of these public employment services in the MENA region are targeting highly educated youth because they're displaying higher than average and increasing unemployment rates. There are other programs that target more lower skilled youth in rural areas and vulnerable populations. The levels of utilization in most developing countries of these existing government services remain low. Jobs obtained through employment services account for just a small share of all placements. And these services that are existing do suffer from a lack of resources. Many are poorly funded or inadequately staffed. very high ratios of job seekers to staff, something like we saw examples as high as 1 to 14,000, 1 to 5,000, 1 to 1,200 in different countries. And these services also rarely include informal sector employers and are less often to be found outside of urban centers. So there's a real space for career centers, but it is important when collaborating with the government to understand what sort of investments they're already making. So on slide 15 here, looking at the limited impact of public employment services on labor market outcomes. So what we see here is in the Arab Mediterranean countries, we have some studies that were showing that, for example, in Tunisia, low internship placement rates. In Algeria, wage subsidies were really shown to benefit companies. And in Morocco, the main state-funded employment programs are overburdened. More broadly, just across developing countries, informal sector work is poorly matched to wage employment interventions, as well as we see generally there's a presence. At present, there's a weak system of monitoring and evaluation, accountability, and beneficiary feedback. So again, there's a lot of room for career centers to be engaged in this, but important to understand what the government is already doing when collaborating with them. Shifting to slide 16, and also shifting to looking at facilitating university and TVET partnerships. On slide 16, we see that collaboration with ministries is important, but really those collaborations within the institutions where career centers are located are also incredibly important. In both universities and TVET, they're dealing with deeply held perceptions about what these different educational institutions' role is in students' employment. So when we talk about universities, they're more perceived as degree factories than providers of employable or skilled graduates, and they perceive their role as sharpening students' theoretical knowledge rather than necessarily linking them to specific employment. In TVET, the institutions often focus on technical skill training rather than job market approaches for students. There's an assumption that within TVET, it's leading directly to employment in a particular industry. So raising the question of why do they also have to teach the whole range of career kind of searching and approaches. Close partnerships with institutional administration are critical for building sustainable career centers, working closely with institutions to develop a sustainability plan, and thinking through when scaling up. Some literature pointed to the fact that each institution has its own administration, and when there are changes in administration, this sort of recommitment to buy-in needs to be affirmed on a regular basis. In terms of the relationship between institutions, administration, and career centers strengthening, frequent reporting was something that was helpful in solidifying this relationship. And then in terms of senior institutional management support, this is also it's important to make sure that support is demonstrated by the university, and that this is a good indicator of whether or not there is this senior level institutional support, things like the provision of faculties or facilities. So whether it's space for the Career Center, for example, the identification of potential internal staff, payment of selected salaries, for example, the director of the center receiving payment from the university administration, budget, and agreement to determine what sort of mechanisms could include the Career Center in the overall university budget and payroll within a few years. So looking for those sorts of indicators of alignment and pushing for those is helpful in making sure these are sustainable partnerships. When done well, we have, for example, one university vice president was describing the Career Center as providing an undeniable value addition because it was enabling the university to fill gaps in students' soft skills. On the next slide, number 17, in addition to engaging with administration, it's very important to engage university and TVET faculty in career centers to mitigate challenges in this front. It's important to involve instructors in career guidance debates, as well as build teacher capacity to deliver career center approaches and activities into their classrooms, beginning with assessments of what teachers already know, and then building on skills needed to deliver these career center approaches. We'll talk a little later about embedded curriculum as a strategy to incorporate soft skills, and then designing engaging roles for faculty. For example, having volunteer trainers who engage students for counseling sessions outside the centers and offices and sometimes homes, providing oversight to credit-bearing internships, and facilitating site visits and other industry involvement in their coursework. So those are some of the examples from literature about how to engage faculty in career centers. On slide 18, we shift to looking at the importance of private sector involvement in career centers. Clearly, this is a very critical piece. It aligns skills developed in career centers to labor market needs. Employers can develop trainees through real-world work experience, can improve the desirability for and understanding of private sector work among youth, and a more systematic coordination of businesses and civil society between public and private partnerships can lead to triangular efforts between career centers, public and private sector companies that could strengthen labor market outcomes and employment outcomes for youth. On slide 19, we look at private sector partners, so collaboration strategies that came up in the literature for universities and TVET centers. There's a fragility of partnerships, particularly when based on the need for sustainable career center funding. So thinking through establishing partnerships based on shared goals, the goal of employing skilled youth, and finding commonality on how career centers and the private sector can both invest in this shared goal is helpful, rather than focusing on the funding need. It's critical to collaborate with small, medium enterprises along with larger businesses. Well, we saw that career centers may find it easier to initially form linkages with larger private sector actors, oftentimes because larger businesses, they have an HR office and it's easier to connect with the career center to that specific person or persons. Economic growth in a lot of countries across the Middle East region is really driven by small, medium enterprises. And their collaboration is key as their labor market demands are different than large businesses, even though it's more difficult to develop these relationships. When we look at the difference between TVET and universities, TVET is more familiar with partnering with private sector than universities. And so considering how lessons can be learned across those two sectors. And then thinking through, we saw that existing industry relationships are often rooted in personal relationships with faculty members, and these should be, in terms of career centers, shifted into institutional relationships that are able to benefit students more equitably. On slide 20, we go into how to ensure effective collaboration with the private sector. One strategy that had some efficacy was looking to use a progressive approach. So starting with small asks, like an invitation to career center events, and using these small points as a way to build up the relationship. From the initial design phase, fostering awareness, information exchange, and involvement, using assessment tools and participatory methods to assess what private sector needs are and to be able to address these needs. Creating industry advisory boards, partnership agreements, and work through industry associations are all strategies for collaboration, and facilitating incentives and opportunities for sponsorship and participation in career center activities and events. On slide 21, so thinking back to that original slide of supply and demand, there are actually different roles that career centers can play in advocating for expanding the pool of jobs desired by TVET and university graduates. So while career centers are firmly on the sort of supply side and making sure that youth are prepared to enter the job market, there are roles of particularly advocacy that career centers can play in helping to improve working conditions, to increase demand and job creation for good jobs, targeting sectors, better understanding the labor market needs, and helping to understand where there are gaps and where the sort of skills and training that career centers are providing can help to fill these gaps. Incentives and supporting incentives for employers to increase hiring, and interventions benefiting private sector firms. A note that it's important that they should create conditions that regulate firm behavior. So thinking through that, interventions should have conditions attached to different subsidies, such as clauses forbidding early dismissal or post-subsidy employment stipulations to avoid exploitation of the system by firms. So career centers can help to advocate on behalf of students and future employees in these areas. Slide 22 takes us to our second research question, which looks at career center approaches. So the question here being, what approaches are these educational institutions taking to promote career development and workforce skills? So we have here on slide 23. So now we're beginning to look a bit more specifically on what exactly is offered in career centers. We've talked about sort of the strategic planning and the initial investments in developing these key partnerships, and now within career centers themselves. We've divided this into sort of two sides here. There's school-based on the left side, which incorporates career education that's embedded within the curriculum. So these are classroom-based curriculum focused on work readiness, teacher methodologies designed to develop soft skills and life skills. So those are working on developing skills such as communication for work, group work, technology, job-focused literacies. In terms of the second bucket there, supplemental spaces and experience designed to expose students to work. So these are within the educational institution, either within the career center space or more broadly at the institution. Things like job talks by employed adults in the community, job fairs, and what's most commonly thought of when you think about career centers is the one-on-one career counseling, so really career guidance that's provided. On the right side of the slide, we look at work-based, and so this is saying where career centers are supporting young people to actually have experiences that bring them into the world of work physically. So workplace visits, job shadowing, things like a one-week placement, internship capstone projects and mentoring programs. So these are really working on skills like professionalism, time management, showing up on time for this visit, being a professional in appearance, planning, seeing what's actually happening in an office space. And finally, on the far right side, we have career center fostered embedded workplace experiences. So these are more temporary or contract employment, apprenticeship, and this is really developing skills like having young people to understand the sort of cycles of work in projects, networking, and sustained professional relationship building. So we'll kind of go through in detail what these look like, both the school-based and work-based sort of approaches. For school-based approaches, so now on slide 25, there's a couple of different ways that career education can look within the curriculum. And first is thinking about developing soft or life skills, and the other is looking more specifically at employability skills. And the difference here being something like a soft or life skill would be, for example, writing well. So making sure that students through their coursework are learning how to write well is a life skill, versus thinking more in the employability range, something like specifically writing a resume would be something that is more of an employability skill, and both of these are important, but slightly different ways that they can be thought about. There's also a difference between looking at embedded curriculum. So, for example, if students are presenting a report in front of the class, that would be something where they're learning a presenting skill, but it's just incorporated into a class that already exists. versus there could be a separate class. For example, there could be a public speaking course where students are learning public speaking skills, but it is a class that is wholly separate from their basic curriculum. Oftentimes, Career Center programs start as separate courses before being embedded into the curriculum. That varies on how the Career Center has been planned out. In terms of the sort of 4 buckets that are on the slide here, we have incorporating job-related skill development into teaching methods. So these are some of the resume writing, learning how to do follow-up emails, problem solving, group work, and presenting. English language training. So this is something that could be already taught within the educational institution, or it could be separately taught and focused on particular industries and vocabulary for those industries. Also, English is one that was commonly mentioned, but other global languages as well are obviously advantageous to particular career tracks. On the right side, we have the delivery of career content through after-school workshops and bringing employers to campus. So we'll talk a little bit more about this next, but entrepreneurship training programs, job talks and job fairs, incorporating visits from local business owners, managers, and employees. And then coursework that incorporates learning technologies, computers, internet, mobile phones. So thinking through how different technologies can be learned by students. On slide 26, in terms of entrepreneurship and self-employment, sort of question of why teach about entrepreneurship. There are other providers of those sort of services as well, but bringing entrepreneurship into the range of formal sector career options is very important, as this really is an option that needs to be considered by youth given the sort of lack of jobs to fit the number of educated graduates coming out. And also, it's important to think through this as changing mindsets and encouraging entrepreneurial attitudes. So thinking more about one's career as their business or kind of a career management skills, being entrepreneurial about one's career. We see that in Career Center programs, some of these did not have entrepreneurship initially, but then it added that in. And it's seen as something important. And youth provided feedback as well that when this isn't included, they feel it's something that's missing. And finally, can think through the synergies between the Career Center ecosystem as well as entrepreneurship ecosystem, and thinking about what are the range of services that are needed to support youth. And there's some synergies between those for looking at jobs more generally and looking at entrepreneurship. One example, we have a couple of cases throughout this here. One example of a career center that is focused on providing entrepreneurship training is here, the Youth Entrepreneurship Development Program. I won't go over this in too much detail, but just there'll be more in the report, but raising awareness of some of the cases that we have throughout the region. Technology, as well as noted on that initial slide, it serves as a platform for career services and a tool to improve students' technology-related jobs and job skills. One career center that has a strong focus on technology use is in Morocco, the USAID Career Center. There's an earlier webinar this year that has a lot of great details about this. Just highlighting here that they had a virtual career center that was a major element of their planning. In general, technology that is in career centers appears to be advantageous, but going back to the M&E statement earlier, there's not a lot of evidence of the exact impact on youth employment, but it can be effective in reaching youth in remote areas. There's a general sense that more can be done to encourage youth to use these online tools. And some of the feedback we saw was a bit mixed on online career services. And we say that because there's a usefulness, of course, to this technology, but also the complexity of some of the sites or places that youth go to access information. Some of these are only in English or French or languages that are require that competency to have full access. And in general, that they're opening up new networks and exposing opportunities. However, it also presents a difficulty of sifting through and finding reliable information online. And there are a lot of examples of different technology platforms across the MENA region. Just to give a few. There's an employability platform launched in collaboration with Microsoft across 9 Arabic countries. We see services like LinkedIn that are being offered now in Arabic, and universities often on their websites are promoting different career-related workshops, events, as well as career services. On slide 31, sort of the standard of what we hear about career centers is career guidance, and this is a very important aspect of what career services are doing. Students and parents, there's a lot of information, and some of this is looking globally, some of this information that's available, but that students should really begin career guidance early within basic education. And the reason for this is when career thinking is emerging. We saw evidence that students who just received career education at the tertiary level experienced frustration, saying that they were a bit trapped by choices they had to make earlier in their educational career. And we see evidence that a slower, difficult transition to the labor market can have lasting impacts on individuals' career and future income. So thinking through some of these decisions at the earliest stage is quite important. Youth highlighted on the slide here, it says that the different areas that career guidance has helped them. So achieving personal goals, boosting self-confidence, know how to behave in a job interview, understanding how to make career decisions, identifying strengths, and knowing about availabilities and what is out there in the labor market. So one way that career centers work on this sort of awareness and availability, we have things like job fairs and job talks, which are given. Those are the efficacy of those. It's very hard to know what a single job talk actually results in the long run on whether or not that influences a student's decisions about their careers, but this exposure is very important and something that is valued. And finally, that young people, particularly just before graduation, are in need of support in that transition of actually thinking about how do I apply for these specific jobs and how do I land my first job. Slide 32, in terms of globalized trends towards customized services and connected communities. So also in the career guidance space, we see that there are some changes that appeared in the literature in terms of personalized communities and experiences within and beyond campus, becoming more common rather than career counseling and professional networking alone. And career center services and staff are catered to more individual needs and offering specialized services focused on mentoring and technology and bringing these together. One thing within that is important to highlight is that communities of career support for youth are especially important in middle-income countries with high student counselor ratios. So as we see some of the stats there, if there's really one counselor to 300 or 800 youth, it's important that youth themselves are encouraged to form communities of career support. So looking into that a little bit more, which leads into our third research question, which is on whether career centers are giving youth the opportunities to design, plan, and lead. And so part of this is that youth can be involved in creating these communities of career support. While this is something that, as we talked about, the career center design, the planning, these initial phases, you may now realize that youth were not mentioned in the literature. We did not see that youth were being involved in those initial relationship building as much in terms of that inclusivity question, but it is very important that youth are involved in career center design, as well as the implementation and management. In the next couple of slides, we'll see more on youth being involved in promotion and outreach, planning and change processes, and giving youth leadership over certain activities. Youth are also well positioned to solicit regular feedback from participants and alumni of Career Center services and programs. In terms of developing career-focused communities among youth, what we see is networking among participants, for example, student volunteer networks, supporting Career Center events and activities. Career Centers have also developed databases of individuals who have participated in programs and promoting these sort of networks. Also, career centers can play a role in being a physical space. The offices could function as community centers for students to informally discuss and engage on career and other decisions that are coming up as students thinking about their career options. On slide 35, in terms of giving youth opportunities to lead, we did see that career center programs, many of them did a great job of encouraging and giving opportunities such as youth ambassadors, promoted career centers and their services among distant campuses and other institutions and students. Some career centers successfully enlisted student volunteers and activists to support employment fairs and other activities and events. However, we did also see that it is important to ensure that youth are formally recognized or given official status for their role within career centers. Youth are very overburdened with their existing responsibilities, and it is important that they're recognized for these efforts. So these are just some of the spaces where youth were being very actively solicited for their assistance. However, there are equally, as mentioned, the designing, the planning, some of those initial kind of partnering stages where youth could actually be much more involved than they currently are. On slide 36, we shift to looking at work-based career center approaches. And these are, again, introducing students to the workplace. Some, I guess, easier to organize, we'll say, activities are things like job shadows and job visits. These receive positive feedback from youth and are relatively inexpensive. There are also one-week taster programs. And of course, with something with a short-term exposure like this, it's very unclear what the impact is on students. This hasn't been well measured. But for employers, in one study, we saw that 90% of employers thought that 1 week was enough. And really what that's saying is that it's much easier to facilitate something like a 1 week program that at least allows students to go out and see and experience a workplace than it is to get, for a large number of students, internships that require substantial employer involvement. So when you think about sequencing and the age and what kind of experiences are necessary for different students, these are alternatives that are not as in-depth, but they do provide some exposure and awareness. And we see that research studies suggest young people particularly value information on jobs and careers if obtained in a real workplace and through context with working people. So these are some strategies that are a bit less labor intensive and can be more broadly applied than longer term work experiences, workplace experiences. However, shifting to the next slide, on slide 38, we look at some of the longer term options, which of course provide deeper and richer exposure for young people. And we see things like internships, sustained mentoring, practicum experiences. In research that's coming from the European Commission, looking again more globally, creating the right ecosystem is very important to these work experiences. Providing high quality traineeships requires the involvement of all relevant actors, enterprises, national authorities, social partners, and representatives of youth and trainees. Research coming from the UK suggests that when workplace experiences are of good quality, it is disadvantaged youth who benefit the most from these experiences. And finally, career centers can improve the regulation of temporary work experiences. So in terms of things like internships, there's often across the MENA region, we saw high levels of under-regulation or non-regulation of youth traineeships. So career centers can play a role not only facilitating these experiences, but making sure they're things that students are really gaining strong work experience in a positive work environment. On slide 39, we look at one case from the UAE. And this one I highlighted here because they were particularly focused on work-based learning opportunities, providing on-campus and summer employment programs. So many of the career centers do provide these things, but this one seemed to especially focus on work-based learning opportunities. On slide 40, we get into our kind of final section here and taking a little bit of time to look at the Career Center approaches and how they could compare between TVET and universities. Some unique elements on slide 41 of TVET Career Centers. There's the focus on accreditation of skills and certification is something that's sought in a lot of TVET Career Center services. I think just with what TVET is intended to do is really focusing on technical skills, but also pairing these with soft skills. Looking at pairing TVET skills with entrepreneurship training is something that's quite common as well. You can look through the rest of these here, focusing on expanding technology use to strengthen communication between youth and employers. So these are some of the foci for career centers, specifically within TVET institutions. On slide 42, more broadly, TVET is an alternative pathway to employment. The perception in general for TVET is that it leads to less desirable employment options, but I think career centers can do a lot to really encourage and emphasize the multiple pathways in TVET that can lead to successful transition from education to work across many different sectors. TVET is covering an important percentage of secondary and tertiary level TVET students, and thinking through the ways that career centers can open up and help students to see these multiple pathways is important to fighting perceptions that the university education is the only avenue to social mobility and job security. A couple of cases that are TVET focused career centers. So this one here in Egypt, the WISE activity, and that is one that is focused on matching skills to labor market needs. On slide 44, we have a second example on the Youth Employment Project based in Liberia. And so this is one that particularly focuses, there's a strong emphasis on partnerships. They have a partnership with a regional leader in employability technologies. So really linking up the larger as well as smaller industries, local businesses to the TVET students and making sure that those connections are there as a focus of this career center. On slide 45, we look at the unique elements of career centers and universities. For universities, soft skills are often cited as needed but lacking in recent graduates. And given this need, soft skills are offered in a majority of career center university-housed programs. University career centers are important in linking the theoretical learning to employment. This is something that youth universities highly value, the hands-on employment opportunities and internships that are offered. Introducing soft skills through methods and curriculum design. So thinking on incorporating things like problem solving, teamwork, whether it's through embedded curriculum where teachers are being trained on how to incorporate these skill development into their current coursework. Other coursework that's being offered at universities that relates to career centers and career education, often English language training, computer skills, and entrepreneurship. Also to note, in universities, globally, public universities face pressure to become lucrative research-based institutions, but this could also be in some ways seen as a positive for career centers, as these sorts of existing private sector linkages through research might also open spaces for private sector collaboration with career centers. On slide 36, one thing to kind of emphasize about career centers and universities is that while these are providing an important need in youth employability and service delivery, these are something that are new in universities. Career guidance is new in universities throughout the MENA region. So it's important to note that it does take time to develop these partnerships and ensure that it's understood of what the goal of these programs are and how universities can play an influential role in students' transitions out of the university. We have a few examples here. If we go to slide 47 of career centers that are focused on and integrated into universities. We have the Linking Education Employment Program in Egypt. There's also a program we didn't put a slide on, but in the webinar that was given on career centers earlier this year, there's another program at the American University of Cairo that's also focused on universities here in Egypt. A second program on slide 48 here in Algeria is the University Linkages Program in Promoting Education Altruism and Civic Engagement, the PEACE program, focused on skills like learning English, as well as career guidance and soft skills training. On slide 49, so to summarize some preliminary conclusions, what we see and know to be true here, I think we can say, are that career centers are an important resource for youth who are completing secondary TVET and university studies. Career centers can and should look different based on who they're intended to support, the context in which they will operate, and the available resources. And key considerations should frame strategic planning and should be begin before initial investments in career centers or when considering ongoing resources required to sustainably operate career centers. So that is what we have from our desk review for today. I appreciate the opportunity to share this with you. And just a reminder that we also look forward to your feedback in response to our electronic survey and through select key informant interviews that will help us to fill gaps in this literature that's available and to specifically address our research questions in the final report. At this time, we'll transition to questions, Q&A period. I know my colleague has been collecting if there are questions throughout. Additionally, have the option of raising your hand, and you could ask a question through your microphone. Should I just keep?
Thanks, Amy. This is Meredith, everyone. I'm just going to share a couple of questions that we've received, but as Amy said, if you do have questions, please feel free to type them into the chat box and then we can read them aloud and discuss. Also, feel free to raise your hand and speak into your microphone. So first question that we received from Nabila is, should career centers be concerned with empowering and guiding work seekers to invent work for themselves, like through entrepreneurship, starting their own businesses? Or should they be limited to seeking the existing work opportunities and preparing and matching work seekers to them? So a question of how we're responding to the employment market in a given country, creating entrepreneurship opportunities, facilitating that for people, or focusing more on responding to existing markets.
Sure. All right. Everyone able to hear that question? I'll summarize the question before I get started on answering, and we also have Khadija. So I'll start this one. I think I have some ideas, and then if you have anything else to add as well, we'd love to hear your voice too. The question was really looking at whether, my understanding was that if career centers should focus on just matching youth to existing jobs in the labor market, or to what extent, if and to what extent, entrepreneurship and job creation should be part of what career centers do. And I think from the slide, particularly on entrepreneurship, and the literature that discussed, why and how that could be included into career centers, I do think that the realities of the labor market present that that job matching is not enough, because there are not enough formal jobs that exist to match the number of graduates that are coming out of tertiary education in a lot of countries. And so I think what we saw was that entrepreneurship is something very important to open up as an option. And a benefit of talking about entrepreneurship through career centers is that it helps to bring the possibility of entrepreneurship into a formal discussion, I won't call it a formal sector discussion, but a formal discussion about it being something that can exist as a full-time career and can be considered a career option. Obviously, not every iteration of kind of small informal business falls into this category, but I think by presenting it through career centers and offering training and services to provide, and this is where the sort of ecosystem of looking at, what do job seekers need, what does someone starting a business need, and how career centers can do a lot to support young people who are interested in that as a path. And I do think that is something that is quite important for career centers to emphasize, in addition to the services they provide in matching skills. Khadija, did you have something else you?
Yeah. So in the literature, we found that there is some career centers that are focused only on entrepreneurship, which this is the case of Palestine, for example. There is other career centers that are doing or offering entrepreneurship besides soft skills and other services or work skills or job skills. And there is other career centers in MENA region that are not offering at all entrepreneurship. It's the case of Morocco, career centers in Morocco, in Tunisia, in Algeria, the LEAP programs in Egypt, and in the Emirates also. What the researchers say about it is that the career programs should include the entrepreneurship programs, because there is a catching sentence from one of the authors that say, "My career is my business." So the notion of career self-management is essential, is important. In the countries where there is entrepreneurship program, the youth found it very valuable and very important for them, because, as you said, Amy, the economy does not produce enough jobs, so they have to start their own business. But the other side of this initiative is that the career centers have to train their staff on how to develop a business plan, finding a lot of training or a lot of capacity building that need to be done besides other trainings that they offer.
Okay, thank you, Khadija. I think we're going to lead with another question, Meredith. Thank you.
Sorry, if you had a little trouble hearing the last question, I will try to speak closer to the microphone. Next question is, if we looked at strategies for sustainability, like revenue or fees for career centers, and what has shown to be effective?
Sure, this is a really important question, because I think we framed a lot of this in terms of sort of this initial investment and ongoing resources, and there's a lot of cost that is involved in career centers. However, in a lot of the literature, we didn't have really specific information. I think it's fairly easy to estimate, if you put it on a scale of, certain interventions cost more, there are more people involved, there's more time involved, certain are easier to facilitate and less costly. But in terms of actually generating revenues and fees, we didn't find a whole lot of information. I think one interesting point was within the discussions of the role of job fairs. And I think it makes sense when you think about what a job fair is doing. A lot of career centers were able to use these. So essentially having businesses that would pay a fee to be able to have a booth or some sort of representation at a job fair. And this was something that, is a benefit that students are being able to have this exposure to different companies. Often they're presenting or looking to hire and are able to see exactly what sort of roles and positions are available and what skills are being needed and backgrounds for those. And they were also a source of regular revenue for the Career Center. Apart from looking at job fairs, there was not a whole lot of literature on other real sources of revenue, so I don't, yeah, I could get into ideas, but I'd like to keep this just based on what we were actually able to see. And unfortunately, there just isn't a whole lot of details. And some of that is what's included in different literature sources and things, and that a lot were more broad rather than specifically honing down to in one specific career center, laying out sort of the budget and the revenue streams and things like that. I don't know if Khadija, you had anything else that you saw on this, but that was my takeaway.
The same comments. It's the financial sustainability is lacking. We didn't find any career center that is financially sustainable, and the key things that career centers do to be sustainable is to collaborate with existing governmental entities or private sectors or employment agencies.
Absolutely, yeah. So highlighting those partnerships and the fact that finding mutual points of interest and need are really, or I guess that's really why those are so critical in this space. Yeah. Another question.
A question from, looks like somebody at Catherine at World Learning, who would like to hear more about how career centers are impacting policy and legislation. For example, World Learning has been working on establishing a national career center federation led by career centers and would like to help guide them toward increased policy influence.
Sure. Thank you. That is a great question. And as I reflect on what we know and don't know about this, I know there's a slide that we put up on the demand side interventions and how career centers can be advocates for better policies, better workplace policies, as well as better experiences for students going into initial sort of internship and other experiences. And again, I think that these are all things that can have a strong influence, and they were things that career centers were encouraged to do in the literature. But in terms of actual results, I don't see that there are any really great examples that are coming to mind as to where policy advocacy has been successful. However, I think that is, for me at least, a really interesting area that I would love to include on the survey, as well as talking in interviews, because I think for both of these, the idea of cost, often when you have published materials, people are a bit loath to put exact financial budgeting numbers into something that gets published, as well as this policy piece. I think because it is perhaps seen as a little, it's tangential to, and I think about career centers having their main goal is to support the development of young people and their skills and their ability to find jobs. When you think about the other roles that career centers can play, it's unclear if it was just because that's secondary, not included in the literature examples we saw. But if this is something we could put into the survey and interviews, we might be able to ask some of these more peripheral questions that I think are incredibly important, but perhaps those examples just were not included in the published literature on this topic.
Yeah, and regarding that, I think that the problem in MENA region is that there is no evaluation study that highlights the impact or the positive impact of career centers on employment. So the non-availability of statistics makes it difficult for policy makers to adopt like the concept of career center or specific measures to facilitate the inclusion of youth in the labor market. But what we found through the literature is that government or policy makers are more aware about the importance of career centers because of those initiatives that they saw, and because they were involved in those initiatives, because the concept of career guidance or career center is new to the MENA region, and there is still some countries that don't do that at all. Raising awareness about the importance of career guidance in universities or in vocational training centers, that was an important thing that was done by the career center initiative through the MENA region.
We had a last comment come in about the sustainability of Morocco. Note that TVET courses are financially sustainable, fully funded, and institutions. Khadija, do you want to say anything about that?
I didn't hear you well. Could you please repeat the question?
I'm going to come closer. Sorry, we had a comment in the chat about that TVET career centers in Morocco are financially sustainable, fully funded, and staffed by Moroccan public TVET institutions.
Yeah, because the TVET institutions in Morocco, like they had already one of the part of their jobs is to link their youth to employment. So they have already like a department or a kind of department that help youth to go to find internships in existing businesses. So the career centers in Morocco came and they built the career or their staff, the capacity of their staff in finding opportunities or linking youth to businesses. So they already have this part, but it was strengthened or reinforced by the career center, USAID career centers.
All right, thank you, DJ. Yeah, we noticed in the chat as well, we have, I think, some really good information from Catherine on some details about fee services and having students, asking students to pay something for those versus a risk of having them for free. And I think this is something that will be very interesting to include in our survey of looking at particularly the questions of revenues and fees, and both how career centers can consider different ways to raise fees, and what are some of the risks around doing that, as well as this question of policy impact. And we had another question that came in about improving the policy work. Sorry, but essentially looking at improving the working conditions in a country. And I think that really relates to this question of sort of, is there a policy role? How can career centers, knowing what students are, what's hindering them from perhaps looking for private sector work, what is exciting about or encouraging about work in different sectors, and how career centers can help to make sure that different work environments are all providing attractive jobs that are desirable to youth. So it's very helpful. Yeah. Oh, okay. I realize it is now 10:30. So in respect for people's time, I'm sorry I got started a few minutes late here, but I appreciate the opportunity to present this information. There's some great comments. I see a few extra comments that are coming in here, so I encourage everyone to also look through those chats here. And again, this is really one step in the larger report. So we look forward to engaging with you all in our next steps and and then being able to share a report with you in early next year. So thank you so much for your time. And
just one note, we will, as I mentioned in the chat early in the webinar, we have been recording this, so we will finalize that and share the recording with you all, so you can share that with any other colleagues as well. We thank everyone very much for your participation, for your questions and your input. This was, I think, as interesting and insightful for us from your questions as we hope it was for you.
thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.